They thought humans would hide. They had no idea humans were made for this. Welcome to Sci-Fi Stories HFY. Hit subscribe, because it only gets more intense from here. The quiet before the storm. The Ardennes crossing was not a warship. She had never pretended to be one. She was a Class 7 heavy freighter, 412 meters from bow to stern, her hull pocked with micrometeorite scars and painted in the dull ochre of the Meridian Freight Collective. Her cargo holds were packed to capacity with processed titanium sheets, pharmaceutical-grade chemical compounds, and 17,000 liters of pressurized hydroponic nutrient slurry destined for the outer colony on Carrie Van 4. She moved through the deep black of the Oris corridor at a reliable, unhurried 0.4 lightspeed cruise, her twin fusion drives humming like a pair of sleeping giants. Her crew numbered 41. Chief Cargo Officer Mara Voss stood at the bridge viewport, watching the distant smear of the Carrie Van Nebula paint the stars in shades of violet and orange. She held a mug of synthetic coffee that had long gone cold. She didn't care. She liked the weight of it in her hand, something solid to hold while her mind wandered the deep quiet that only deep space travel could produce. Voss. The voice came from the navigation pit. It was Ensign Dalis Cho, young and sharp-eyed, barely 3 years out of the Meridian Freight Academy. We're picking up an unregistered mass signature. 6,000 kilometers, closing at lateral drift. Lateral drift? Voss set down the mug. Not following the corridor lanes? No. It's pacing us. It's been pacing us for about 11 minutes. She moved to the tactical display and studied the contact. The profile was wrong for a freighter, too compact, too agile in its positioning. The signature return had the kind of angular geometry that didn't come from commercial design. It came from ships that were built to approach other ships without being seen until it was already too late to matter. "Get me Captain Aerith," she said quietly. Captain Silas Aerith arrived on the bridge 40 seconds later, still pulling on his duty jacket. He was a large man, weathered in the way that long-haul spacers always became, skin like old leather, eyes permanently narrowed from years of staring at screens in low-lit cabins. He looked at the display for a long moment without speaking. "Hailing frequencies?" he asked. "Tried twice," Cho said. No response. Aerith put both hands flat on the console and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Everyone remember your boarding drills," he said. He looked up at Voss. "Lock the manifest vaults. Wake the whole crew." He said nothing else because there was nothing else to say. Everyone on the bridge already knew. Pirates. The boarding. They came in fast when they finally moved. The raider vessel, later identified from hull markings as the Kurath Fong, a Vithali-class predator ship favored by the Vosk Syndicate, dropped its stealth profile and closed the distance in under 4 minutes. It was a beautiful ship in the way that knives are beautiful. Sleek, purposeful, without a single gram of wasted design. It latched onto the Ardennes crossing at 2 points simultaneously, one at the forward cargo bay and one at the crew habitat ring amidships, electromagnetic grapples biting into the freighter's hull with a resonant clang that shuddered through every deck. The pirates were Vithali, a species from the outer reaches of the Oris system, bipedal and lean, averaging about 2 meters in height, with 4 upper limbs instead of 2. Their 2 primary arms were long and powerful. Their secondary arms, positioned lower on the torso, were shorter and more dexterous, used for fine manipulation. Their sensory organs were clustered in a narrow facial ridge above a wide, flat mouth filled with serrated boneplate teeth. They were fast. They were strong. They were, in every sense of the word, built for violence. The syndicate boarding party numbered 38, split across the 2 entry points. They breached the airlocks with military-grade cutting charges and poured into the ship expecting what they always found when they boarded human freighters. Crew members huddled in whatever room had the thickest door, too frightened to fight, waiting to be restrained and locked in the cargo hold while the syndicate stripped the ship of anything valuable and departed before any corridor authority response vessel could arrive. It had worked 87 times before. Syndicate boarding leader Threshvar moved through the smoke of the breached airlock at the forward bay, his 4 arms raised in the combat spread posture that the Vithali called the opening form, a stance designed to grapple, control, and subdue at close range. His team spread behind him in a fan formation, weapons raised, visors scanning. The corridor ahead was empty. Dim emergency lighting painted everything in pale red. He gestured 2 fingers forward. His team advanced. What they didn't know, what the Vosk Syndicate's intelligence on human behavior had apparently failed to account for, was that the Arden's crossing carried a crew assembled from a very specific demographic of humanity. Deep hull freighter workers. Outer corridor veterans. People who had spent years in the tight, unforgiving spaces of large cargo vessels, where disputes were settled in galley rooms no bigger than a cargo container, where a person's ability to handle themselves in close quarters was sometimes the difference between finishing a run and not finishing it at all. 41 humans who understood, in their bones, the geometry of small spaces and the brutal arithmetic of confined combat. Chief Engineer Tomas Rek had spent 8 years in a Martian mineral extraction crew before going civilian freight. He weighed 112 kilograms, most of it in his chest and shoulders, and his preferred tool in any mechanical dispute was a 900mm torque wrench that he had named, without irony, Patience. Patience was currently resting across his shoulders as he waited in the maintenance corridor beside Cargo Bay 4. He was not alone. The corridors, remember. The Vithali were accustomed to humans retreating. They were not accustomed to the doors opening. Threshvar's forward team had made it 30 meters down the main cargo corridor when the side hatch on their left blew open, not from a charge, but from a boot, a heavy steel-toed work boot belonging to cargo handler First Class Davi Oren, who came through the opening shoulder first, already moving, and drove the point of his elbow into the nearest Vithali's facial ridge with the concentrated force of a man who had been doing hard physical labor since he was 16 years old. The Vithali went down. Its 2 primary arms had been raised to grapple. It had not expected a strike. That was the first lesson the boarding party received about humans. In the tight corridors of a working freighter, where a Vithali's reach advantage and extra limbs counted for less, where there was no room to extend or spread, a human who decided to close the distance and make it ugly was a very different problem than a human cowering behind a sealed door. Voss had organized the crew into response teams in the 7 minutes between Cho's detection and the breach. She knew the ship the way she knew her own body. She knew which corridors narrowed. She knew which junctions were barely wide enough for a single person. She knew the maintenance shafts, the service tunnels between the cargo stacks, the low overhead sections of the engineering wing where anyone over 1.8 meters had to duck. She had placed her people accordingly. Rek and his engineering team hit the aft boarding party from 3 directions simultaneously. The maintenance shaft above Junction 9 disgorged 2 crew members directly onto the backs of Vithali soldiers who had not thought to look up. In the narrow confines of the passage, where none of the boarders could use their reach and all 4 of their arms became a hindrance rather than an advantage, constantly fouling against the walls, against each other, the humans fought with wrenches and lengths of pipe and cargo strap and, in the case of medic Suri Chanda, with a bone-setting mallet that she had packed in her kit for entirely different purposes. The Vithali were strong. They were fast. In open space, with room to move, they were formidable. But Threshvar had not studied human history. He had not read about the centuries of war that humanity had spent perfecting the art of fighting in castles and trenches and urban ruins, in doorways and stairwells and rooms barely large enough to turn around in. He did not know about the doctrines, ancient by galactic standards, that had evolved across generations of humans who learned that when you cannot run and cannot maneuver, you close in and you make every centimeter of contested ground cost something. The Arden's crossing was not a castle, but her corridors were just as merciless. Voss directed the response from the secondary command node on Deck 3, a cramped secondary bridge used for cargo coordination, its walls lined with screens showing feeds from the ship's interior cameras. She watched Rek's team work. She watched Oren lead a 3-person group through the service tunnels that ran parallel to the main corridor, surfacing ahead of the advancing boarders and then withdrawing, surfacing again, never engaging more than 2 at a time, keeping the Vithali from consolidating their numbers. She had studied the shape of this ship for 6 years. She knew that the forward cargo bay had 3 choke points before it opened into the main hold, 3 junctions where the corridor width dropped to less than 2 meters. She positioned crew at all 3, not to hold them, but to slow the Vithali down, to make them bunch up, to strip the formation advantage that a numerically superior boarding party depended on. Because the fundamental truth about boarding actions, the truth that every freight crew in the outer corridors learned eventually, either in a training room or in a bad moment at the end of a dark hallway, was that the ship belonged to the people who knew it. Every junction, every shaft, every door that stuck and every hatch that opened inward when you expected it to open outward. That knowledge was worth more than any number of extra arms, any speed advantage, any tactical formation the Vithali had drilled on the surface of their homeworld. The Arden's crossing was 41 people's home, and they had no intention of giving it away. Threshvar reassesses. 20 minutes after the breach, Threshvar made a decision that would save the lives of his remaining crew members. He called a halt. He was crouched in the forward cargo bay, behind a stack of titanium sheets that had been partially shifted in the fighting, his lower right arm pressed against his side where a human woman he had never seen before had struck him with something mechanical and then vanished back into the service shafts before he could respond. 2 of his soldiers were down in the corridor behind him. Not dead, the humans weren't killing, he had noted that with grudging professional respect, but down, wrist-bound with cargo strap, breathing hard. He reviewed the audio from his team's contact lenses. He watched the footage from the amidships breach, his soldiers funneling into corridors that became progressively tighter, the humans always retreating just enough to pull them forward and then appearing from the sides and above, always striking first, always at the joints and pressure points, always grappling and controlling and moving back into the dark before a proper counter could be mounted. They were not fighting like civilians protecting a cargo hold. They were fighting like people who had decided that their ship was a weapon and their knowledge of it was the ammunition. In 22 minutes of engagement, his 38-strong boarding party had successfully reached 1/3 of the forward cargo corridor, the entrance vestibule of the habitat ring, and nothing else. They had not breached a single manifest vault. They had not secured a single crew member. They had, on the other hand, lost 12 soldiers to restraint, for more to injuries significant enough to pull them from the engagement, and they were being systematically bled by an opponent that refused to stand still and refused to run far enough to actually disengage. It was, Threshvar recognized with something approaching professional admiration, a textbook attrition defense. The humans had no intention of winning a straight fight. They were making the cost of staying unacceptably high while never giving his team a worthwhile target. Every time his soldiers pushed, the humans gave ground and then flanked. Every time his soldiers held, the humans probed and tested and found the gap. There was no front line. There was no decisive point to strike. There was only the ship, and the ship was theirs in a way that 38 Vithali soldiers, no matter how capable, were simply never going to overcome. He opened a channel to the Kurath Fong. "Disengage grapples," he said. His second, Rovar, responded immediately. "Boarding leader, we have not secured the manifest vault. Syndicate command will." "Disengage," Threshvar said again, and his tone ended the argument. The grapples released with a heavy clunk that resonated through the Arden's crossing from stem to stern. Threshvar's team withdrew to the breach points in good order, carrying their restrained and injured. The humans did not pursue them to the airlocks. They fell back to guarded positions and watched, which Threshvar found he respected more than he wanted to admit. No grandstanding. No attempt to push an advantage that would have cost them people. They simply held what was theirs and waited for the threat to leave. The Kurath Fong separated from the freighter and accelerated into the dark. The debrief. 3 hours later, the Arden's crossing resumed its heading toward Carivan-4. The grapple points on the hull were dented and scorched. Cargo Bay 4 had a wall panel that would need replacing. Medic Chanda was treating 7 crew members for contusions, 1 dislocated shoulder, and 2 cracked ribs. The dislocated shoulder belonged to Rek, who had, in his own words, gotten careless with a corner. Captain Aerith filed the incident report from the bridge, reading each line into the recorder in his measured, unhurried voice. Corridor Authority investigators who reviewed the report later would note, with some surprise, that none of the 41 crew members had been seriously injured. That the boarding party of 38 had departed after capturing 0 cargo, 0 credits, and 0 crew members. That 12 Vithali soldiers had been left behind, restrained and medically stable in Cargo Bay 4, collected with what the report described as standard crew response procedures. What the report couldn't capture, was the look on Davi Oren's face when Mara Voss asked him, while they were debriefing in the galley over actually hot coffee, whether he'd been scared. He turned the mug in his hands and thought about it for a real, honest moment. "A little," he said. "At the start, before the door opened." Voss nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Fear lived in the waiting. In the closing distance, in the unknown geometry of what was coming down the corridor. But the moment you stepped through the door, the moment you committed to the space and made it yours, something older than fear took over. Something the Vosk Syndicate, and the Vithali boarding teams, and every raider who had ever studied human freight crews from a comfortable intelligence report had apparently never thought to account for. Humans had been fighting in tight spaces since before they had left their own planet. They had built walls and then fought over them. They had dug trenches and held them. They had learned, at extraordinary cost across centuries of their own brutal history, how to make a disadvantageous position into a killing ground through nothing more than will, preparation, and a willingness to move toward the thing that was frightening them. Space, it turned out, was just another corridor. And the humans of the Arden's Crossing had walked every meter of it. The Kurath Fong was never definitively identified again in the Oris corridor. Whether Threshvar submitted his own report to Syndicate Command was never known. But freight crews across the Meridian routes began telling the story, the way spacers always pass along the things worth knowing. Quietly, precisely, without embellishment, over cooling cups of synthetic coffee in the galleys of ships that were not warships and had never needed to be. 41 crew. 38 boarders. 0 cargo lost. Don't board human ships in tight corridors. They've been practicing for that their whole history.